These fish have no eyes. But they're not the only strange creatures you can find lurking in the foliage. This is a story of biodiversity, and how a series of unexpected changes turned this place into a flourishing underground ecosystem. This project started with building a stand, because I needed another surface to support my aquarium addiction. There'd be tanks on top, storage on the bottom, and tanks in the middle. Or maybe one big tank. I couldn't decide. But I did have all the materials sitting around taking up space for a long time, so at some point I just picked a design and ran with it. Usually something goes wrong early on when I'm setting up a project, but this whole build went surprisingly smoothly considering all of my goofy design decisions and how cheap all the materials were. If it wasn't made of scrap, it was made of old furniture. For instance, I found this second-hand table online for a great price, and I cut a chunk out of it. Then I used the rest as a countertop for other tanks and random stuff. Underneath, I wired some regular ceiling lights, and then I started building a tank. The previous owner left this one outside in the cold for way too long, and it wouldn't hold water anymore. So they gave it to me for free, and I could recycle the glass. I settled on making one big tank because I didn't want to miss the opportunity to make something weird and unique. But while I was putting it together, I had no idea what direction it was headed, or that it was going to take a whole year to mature. And if I did, I'd probably have made a lot of different decisions. Nevertheless, I added a plastic ceiling on a whim to protect the lights from the water. But in the end, it was that choice that accidentally drove the entire design, because I thought if the tank has a ceiling, maybe I should just be building a cave. The surface of this lava rock is covered in little patches of dried moss and other signs of weathering. I'm hoping they'll bring some character to the cave walls. I collected this tree root from a local riverbank because I wanted something to build the scape around. It's nice when a composition can tell a story, so I trimmed it to size and it became a perfect starting point. Rather than just putting rocks everywhere, it provided a dynamic line for the eye to follow across the tank. I started by placing rocks around the root to give its organic shape some motivation, and because I wanted to paint the picture of a tree root that had broken through the surface into a hidden cave. Also, by keeping the hardscape off the bottom of the tank, I'd be stealing less water volume from the fish in what's already a shallow space. When I was happy with the layout, I sprayed expanding foam between the gaps, so that everything would be held in place when I flipped the tank upright again. I also ran this plastic hose along the upper corner, because a water feature could explain why the cave's flooded. I hid the hose under the foam, and after everything had set, it was more than strong enough to hold all the rocks and wood without any chance of anything coming loose. But it was definitely ugly. I knew from working with it before that if you carve off its smooth shell, you'll find a spongy interior, full of holes formed by air pockets. And they're not too dissimilar from those found in igneous rocks like the ones I'm using. Even after sculpting the foam by hand, it wasn't as beautiful as the real rocks I was trying to mimic. But being on the walls and ceiling, it needed to be as lightweight as it was. Plus, the product was designed for use with ponds and fish, so it was also a convenient way of sticking everything together without introducing a bunch of different materials and chemicals. I wanted to hide the heater somewhere, so I left some space in the bottom left and I buried it with a pump. I kept the foam off them with some offcuts from the plastic ceiling, but just in case the heater ever broke or the pump got clogged, I carved it open again and filled the void with some filter sponge. To hide the electronics even better, I drilled a hole in the ceiling for some more hose, but this time I thread the wires through. Finally, the DIY was almost done. I just needed to wiggle the tank into place and wire up the lights. When I turned them on, the highlights helped blend together the different materials, and it looked more like a believable place, but it was just too clean, which is not ideal for the fish. They're not going to be at their healthiest in a sterile environment. So building on a base of garden soil makes sure there's plenty of life at the bottom of the food chain for the plants and the microfauna to thrive. On top of that, there's a thick layer of sand to keep everything in place. It's also a medium for the good bacteria to grow in. And then obviously you need water. One of my other tanks is overflowing with Java moss, so I harvested some clumps from it and used it to silence the running water. With a more peaceful soundscape, it's easier to notice and appreciate the softer sounds that come from under the water. Introducing plants kicked up a lot of dust from the very fine sand. But I quite liked the foggy atmosphere it created. With this much water and good bacteria already in the soil, adding 20 little shrimp on day one was no problem for the system to handle. These guys came from my other shrimp tanks with colourful shrimp in them. But after generations of mixing different lines, they start to lose the bright colours that they were bred for. And actually I prefer the more interesting colours and patterns they develop because they're closer to what they have in the wild. They all seem to look completely unique, so even after they'd wandered off to graze on the sand and on the rocks, I could still tell which was which. I deliberately left a handful of gaps and caves around the tank where they can go for darkness and privacy. On this half of the tank you can see the entrances to 3 caves, 2 of which are even connected by a tunnel, so the shrimp can do whatever it is shrimp do for fun behind the scenes. There were now over 100 shrimp in the tank, over 200 maybe, and they all looked busy all the time, like they were each an important part of the shrimp society. Really, I should say they formed a society of crustaceans, because there was an entirely different species among them, which was a kind of ostracod. You could see a lot of them walking around on the sand. Well, actually there were literally millions of them. Because when you set up a new tank, there's an abundance of things they like to eat, like algae and dead plants. I just refilled the water that had evaporated over the first few months, and with the level being higher now, there was a lot of food on the menu that was previously out of reach. Especially on the tree root, because it was directly below one of the lights. Every plant and animal in the tank seemed to be thriving, and there was nowhere you could look without seeing some kind of life. That said, there was still room for more shrimp, more plants, and a long list of other creatures. Water had climbed along the moss that I added and resurrected some kind of lichen in the porous rock. It ended up inspiring me to diversify even further, with a handful of plants I took from under a waterfall in the forest. I also got some leaf litter while I was there. I rinsed everything to remove any mud and debris, then soaked it as well to remove any pests. All of these came from a natural stream up on the moors where it starts, so they're going to be free of pollutants and anything else that could disrupt the system. There are mosses, grasses, and a couple of leafy stem plants, though I'm not sure if they'll all take to the new home, with less mud and a slightly warmer climate. Dead leaves from trees are the foundation of probably most freshwater ecosystems, so it's no surprise seeing all the shrimp coming out of the woodwork to have a taste. If you remember the ostracods eating the decaying bits of plants in the tank, well, this is a layer of food that will also act as a home to all the different microscopic scavengers. The shrimp love it, and it'll provide plenty of hiding places for what comes next. A whole bunch of coolie loaches. They hid for a while and then settled as a pile of stripy noodles among the grass. They're a lot more social than the shrimp, and they've also got a lot more personality. Settling in didn't take long, with so much cover to slink around in and so many friends to keep each other company. Touching and tasting everything with their barbells seemed to be priority number one. Digging was next on the list, and boy do they like to dig. I reckon they're mostly looking for food, but they also dig little trenches to hide in, so I usually try and watch them from a distance to make sure they don't get suspicious and dart off under a leaf. But if you do look closely, you can actually see they sift the sand through their gills. And they do need more than just whatever's in the sand, so it was time for the first real food to go into the system. Every shrimp in the tank dropped what they were doing pretty much immediately and scuttled to the middle of the tank to grab one of the pieces, some of which were snatched away, even though there were plenty to go around. The high protein feast must have been very welcome, because it wasn't long before the shrimp started breeding behaviour, which you can recognise by the males flying around frantically while the females are just chilling with their eggs. You don't see any coolie loaches in the daytime because they're nocturnal, but after lights out they're everywhere. They sift the sand looking for tiny particles of food that the shrimp will have left over from that day. But shrimp are active at all hours, so they never really stop stirring and mixing up that top layer of sand with bits of food, piece by piece. Also, they actually vary their own diet by switching back and forth between the sand and the leaves. I spotted a different kind of creature wiggling around in the corner. I think it's a cranefly larva. It'll have crawled out of the wild moss I added, and it's not going to be harmful in any kind of way, so I let it wander around the tank on its own. I watched it meet some of its neighbours, and then it started trying to dig into the substrate. And it did eventually make some progress, but it was taken away by a very curious loach. He crawled off under a leaf, and then just like that I never saw him again. So I guess he finally managed to burrow underground. Or more likely he just got eaten by one of these cheeky guys. A few weeks after covering the walls with plants, you could see evidence of decay. But from all decay comes new life, because there's always something else in the food web that can benefit from decomposition. The nice thing about a paludarium is that you have a land section, and you can see two different environments interact with each other that we usually think of as separate. That said, it wouldn't be a complete ecosystem without something to fill in the gaps above the water. So I've added these isopods that are going to live in the damp moss, where they can help process any dead plants they find. And then you got these springtails which will live all over the place, so they're going to help stop any mould from growing. They're also small enough to walk on the surface of the water, so they can feed on the biofilm and the algae around the edges. Then just as a bonus, I'm going to take some caterpillars that are attacking one of my plants in the kitchen, because rather than just exterminating them, I thought I might as well move them to the cave where they'd actually be welcome. It could be that there aren't enough fresh leaves for them to eat, in which case they won't do well and they'll just become food for something else. But I suppose I'll know based on whether I see a cocoon in there one day. Every species in this tank has its own role to play, and hopefully they'll each go on to multiply and reach a stable population over time. There's already a wide variety, but there are also things not on this list that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. And soon I'll be adding things that are much bigger than any of these. With all the new creatures, I needed a way to keep them contained. Most of them would have trouble crossing the glass walls to jump out, but they'd probably try it, and I didn't want bugs all over the carpet. So I cut a piece of plastic out of the same stuff as the ceiling, and left a little space around the edges for airflow. It was actually kind of a difficult position though to put on the nuts and bolts from the inside. I don't know why this little guy decided that an inert piece of plastic was valuable in any way. But I did have to confiscate it to finish the upgrade. The moss around the running water was nice and juicy, but the parts with less moisture and less light weren't so lush. So the door wasn't just to keep the animals in, but to keep some of the humidity in as well. Now the plants will stay hydrated, and it'll be a bit warmer. I spent an embarrassingly long time trying to figure out how to keep the door open for access, and I came up with about 10 different overcomplicated, convoluted ideas. Then I realised I could just prop it open with the other door. In preparation for some new inhabitants, I decided to play smashy smashy with some spare lava rocks. There was a lot of open space across the middle of the sandbed, and I noticed the Loaches were still timid about coming out into the open. I wanted everyone to feel safer and protected as they crossed to the other side, so I decided to evolve the aquascape a little bit. As usual, the shrimp came to greet the inanimate objects. I tried to form 2 focal points by making 2 rock piles with a natural sort of placement. Smaller pieces were scattered around to blend everything together. Then I made holes above them just to suggest the rocks had somehow crumbled down from above. And just like that, there was a lot more cover to help everyone feel safer. But in practice, their only potential threat won't be relying on line of sight. I'm a simple guy. I just wanted to build a cave and fill it with fish that come from caves. These fish are blind, because evolution took their sight away. And what look like eyes are actually just empty sockets. So their perception of the world comes from a line of sensory organs on each side of their body. Basically, they don't bump into things because they can detect objects through changes in water pressure. They don't have vision for the same reason they don't have brightly coloured scales. They come from underground caves where there isn't any light, so they can use that energy to be scary in some other way. The shrimp know to backpedal if they get too close, because these fish do not give off a friendly vibe. In the wild, they prey on insects like these bloodworms, as well as crustaceans. And when you see the way they attack anything that's vulnerable, it's no wonder the shrimp are so cautious. Like these ones that are sharing a meal while never taking their eyes off the potential danger. Cavefish don't have natural predators, so they see everything as their own territory. And therefore it doesn't take long to get shouted at if you try and touch what's theirs. Even if they couldn't fit a particular food in their mouth, they'd still snatch it for themselves. Let's just say they definitely have anger management issues. I tried adding just 1 spirulina tablet with nothing else. They could smell that it was food, so they chased everyone away and guarded it, until they figured out they couldn't actually break off pieces for themselves. These fish are opportunistic like most omnivores, so they'll happily eat the plant-based food that I give them, if they're able to, but show their carnivorous side given the chance. Despite voraciously fighting over the body though, I don't think they actually assassinated a shrimp. Cherry shrimp have this special ability where they can teleport away in the face of danger. With so many in the tank, I'd be willing to bet the unfortunate one just died of natural causes, and the curious fish were just excited to clean up the mess. I never saw it happen again, so I don't think it's in their nature to hunt this kind of prey. They're just defensive and inquisitive, because I mean, they can't see what's going on. The coolies know what's up, so they aren't bothered by him at all. In fact, they don't even bat an eye, and the shrimp mothers are still happy to walk about in the open carrying all their babies. The upper and lower parts of the tank were developing in parallel, and the green coverage of each was slowly spreading towards the middle. There's a dividing line that separates the two worlds, but it also gives us a way to see how they mirror each other. Microfauna that fill the same role in each system would be side by side, feeding on the same algae right at the boundary. Because almost every food chain starts in the same place at the same scale. A closer look reveals they're nothing alike physically, even though they eat the same things. Then with a step up in size, we see a similar situation. Two young scavengers living in the Java moss. Both sides of the system have a healthy diversity, but for them to be as strong as possible, they'd need to talk to each other, and that can be helped along with one final change to the landscape. By swapping out the biggest rock for an even bigger one, I want to break down that barrier by literally breaking up the surface. The island lets moss take carbon dioxide from the air and fertilizer from the water. Then with some terrestrial plants anchored around the edges, roots can work their way into the rock, stitching everything together. And now that there were leaves above, it was a good time to replenish the ones below, this time using a bigger and more useful variety. The bottom dwellers appreciated having a layer of darkness to disappear into, but mainly the leaves are there to release tannins into the water, because we're going to need them for the last new species. I got some frogs. They're very cute little guys, and like all amphibians, extremely goofy. I was looking for animals that would be a good fit for the tank when I read, Vietnamese mossy frogs are found in flooded caves, so really they were the obvious choice. So really they were the obvious choice to make best use of the entire paludarium. They sit around all day pretending to be moss, and they'll ambush anything that walks in front of their face. At night time though, they go into hunting mode, and you can see evidence of them prowling around the tank, but they're definitely not being as sneaky as they think they are. Once I start hearing random splashes and thuds, I know they're awake. And I also know exactly when they're going to pounce on their prey, because when they're excited they get these twitchy toes. For some reason, one of them just loves climbing on top of the others. And usually it causes a problem for all three of them. But they don't struggle to eat because food usually comes to them, and even if they barely hit their target, their sticky tongue seals the deal. Certain species of frog can't or won't eat underwater, and although these guys like to take a dip now and then, they don't show any interest in the fish or shrimp. Any other fish would be able to see the crickets and drag them underwater, but the blind fish can only find the ones that sink to the bottom. The frogs, on the other hand, can pounce from anywhere at any time. Being nocturnal, mossies like to make noise in the middle of the night. Each of them calls at a different pitch, so I usually know which one is looking for attention. I'd be sitting here trying to record a voiceover and the frogs would just insist on going. would you be quiet for 5 minutes? Look at this little troublemaker. Shut up. Thank you. Anyway, whenever I couldn't do voiceover, I did some private live streams for my patrons. Basically, we just sat and watched the frogs together, but most of the time was just waiting for something interesting to happen. Amphibians will generally just sit still for hours on end, and then when something finally happens, it's really easy to miss. Patience was the name of the game for this project, so thank you very much to everyone who's waited around and supported me while I work on these tanks. Whether you're there for the community or just to learn about natural aquariums, I appreciate all the people sharing stories about their own. In this one, the frogs have grown up to be these little chubby ammonia machines, and you can see it's done wonders for the plants that can absorb that kind of waste. But there is a little bit too much, so to keep the balance I have to change the water, just every 3 months or so. It might even have to be more frequently, if I'm lucky and the frogs spawn tadpoles. The waterfall is covered in a thick layer of moss that cleanses the water as it trickles down into a forest below. There's a happy relationship that goes both ways, because waste from all the different creatures is absorbed by the plants, who use it to compete with each other for access to the light. Leaves providing support as shelter is just the beginning though, since even dead leaves release helpful compounds, all the while providing a base for the bottom of the food chain. Slow and steady adjustments to the environment can create the right conditions. Then diversity in flora and fauna gives the system an answer for everything. So you've got something strong and stable, in the end.